Welcome back. There's a little music. Excellent. Nice to have a nice tune in the evening. I'm Ross Kaminsky, morning show host here on 630 KHOW, in only about 12 hours after my usual time. But this is just such a privilege and a pleasure. You are listening to the first gubernatorial candidate town hall presented by Ready Colorado, the state's leading voice for conservative education reform. You can learn more about Ready Colorado at their Facebook page, facebook.com/ReadyCOLO, if you want to learn more about Ready Colorado. And my first guest is George Brauchier, the district attorney for the 18th Judicial District. And I want to spend just a couple more minutes talking with you about education. And in fact, I would like to maybe start this off by going directly to our phones. And for those of you who are joining us by phone, don't forget you can ask a question by dialing *3 on your phone, okay? *3 on your phone. Also, let me quickly give you the poll question that we're asking right now. Should Colorado create an education savings account where the state places state funding for each student into an account that is controlled by that student's parents to use on approved education expenses like tutors, advanced coursework, and private school tuition? 1 for yes, if you're on the phones, okay? Press 1 for yes, press 2 for no. Press 3 if you're not sure. And again, if you have a question for George Brauchier, *3 to ask a question. And let's go back to the phones and let's grab a call from Judy. Hey, Judy, you're on the show. Do you have a question for George?
I do. Thank you. I am not an advocate of Common Core, and I wondered if you were, and when and if you plan to get rid of it so our state can have history taught, and a few other things they've taken out of the textbooks.
Thank you, Judy.
Yeah, I don't support Common Core. What I support is the idea of the state of Colorado making decisions for the state of Colorado. Probably the biggest downfall of Common Core and what's made it such a political hot potato is that it wasn't part of a conversation that we just had with each other at the legislative level to say, what do we think is best? We were bribed into doing it. It was this congressional thing like, hey, if you just buy into these standards and allow us to make some decisions for you, we'll give you some extra money. That's not how Colorado should be governing itself. That's not how any state should be doing it. We ought to adopt the standards, the system, the tests that we think best for our kids, not because some bureaucrat in D.C. says so.
Let's take another call that relates to something we've been talking about. I'd like to go to Dorothy. Good evening, Dorothy. You're on with Ross and with George Brauchier. What's your question for George?
The question for George is that if the voucher system is set up in the state of Colorado, could it also apply to homeschooling, which I know to be extremely successful in a number of situations?
Thank you, Dorothy.
I suppose it probably could, but I think Dorothy brings up another great reason about why vouchers is good for choice, but what a better option is this ESA, this educational savings account model, where you have these different options available to parents to spend these dollars, these tax dollars, in the way that they think best for their kids. And I think that would probably answer that better than the voucher program.
I'm going to take one last question on education before we move on to other topics, and we'll make our last education question be from Mike, who wants to ask something that is very much on my mind as well. Mike, go ahead with your question for George Brauchier.
Hi, George. We have a massive shortfall in skilled labor in Colorado. What are you going to do to bring vocational education back to the schools? I mean, not every kid's going to college, and we need to fill this workforce.
Thank you, Mike. I had that very same question.
I think it's true. I mean, listen, I remember when I was in high school 6 or 7 years ago. Actually, it's a lot longer than that. But we had vocational and technical education. It was emphasized. And, we're at a place right now where I think it was about 12 years ago, there was a shift. And we were told that every kid that graduates high school in Colorado has to be college ready. That's not reflective of reality for those kids, for the colleges, or even for the economy that we need. I talked to some guys from the construction industry. And they've said that, look, over the next 2 to 3 years, we think we're going to have a need to fill 50 to 100,000 skilled labor jobs, masons, glaziers, pipe fitters, electricians, all these things. And they say we don't have the ability in Colorado to supply those skilled laborers. Yeah. So 2 things happen. 1, the price of construction goes up because we have scarce labor. 2, they're going to start importing people into Colorado from outside here who have those skills on top of the 8,000 to 10,000 people who move here every single month when we should be focusing on these kids. Once again, this ESA model provides for the opportunity for there to be vocational or technical education. One other thing about that, by the way, if we're going to talk about lifetime learners, creating lifetime learners, we need to create a system that doesn't make you pick an if this or this, this or that kind of a model, where at the end of high school, you got to decide, brother, are you going to go to college? Or are you going to go into some sort of skilled labor? Because once you make that decision, you're sort of locked down, and it becomes very difficult to ever get back to get that education after spending 5 or 10 years as something in skilled labor. We need to create a system that encourages people to make a decision and then to decide, you know what, I want to come back and get education.
You are listening to the first gubernatorial candidate town hall presented by Ready, Colorado. My first guest in the series is District Attorney George Brauchier. Very quickly before we move on from education, and we'll have a couple more education poll questions, the results of question number 2, should Colorado create an education savings account? This is an interesting result to me. 49% yes, 28% no, and 23% not sure. So I think we need to make that sale a little better, or work on it a little more. It's going in the right direction. We can, and I'll bring you poll question number 3 in a little bit. Now let's move on to some other issues, George. One of the biggest things in the last legislative session was how to raise money to fund our transportation infrastructure needs. You wouldn't believe, if I, during my morning show, wanted to talk about how upset people are with the roads around here, I could have full lines all show every day. Now, we remain a state, as you just pointed out, with a large influx of population. And Governor Hickenlooper, in one of his moments of being correct about something, said that the expansion of our road capacity has not kept up with the expansion of our population.
What?
I know.
That's crazy.
So what major projects would you want Colorado to prioritize in the first couple of years of a hypothetical Brauchier administration? And how would you propose to fund major infrastructure? And I would like an answer that passes the giggle test in terms of actual feasibility on the funding side.
Yeah, in terms of the major projects, I don't think there's any surprises out there. I think CDOT has done a decent job of saying, look, these are the ones that need to be hit the most. And at the risk of sounding like a guy who's all of a sudden going to be focused on the Denver metro area, the biggest, most urgent need is I-70 and then I-25 north and south of the metro area. Those things are killers for the largest number of working Coloradans and those who want to explore any leisure opportunities up in the mountains. If those things don't get fixed and don't get fixed quickly, the quality of life here will deteriorate to the point that all those millennials that keep moving in that we love to have because we're going to create this second Silicon Valley type environment, they're all going to want to move some other place like Salt Lake City, where they have 10-lane highways rushing you off not only to the big city but back up to the mountains where you can go skiing 30 minutes instead of having to spend hours looking at taillights. Now, there's also a ton of rural roads out there that need to be fixed that are also part of the CDOT plan, but these are things that are different. These aren't fixed because they're just quality of life issues. This is like, if you look at the plains, some of these highways are, how do we get trucks from point A to point B? We're talking commerce. We're talking about getting produce to market. Those have a certain priority too. The bottom line is this funding thing that we've allowed to take place in part exists because CDOT has virtually no oversight to it. The way we have funded CDOT is we have taken the legislature and everybody else out of the decision-making process for what they do. We don't prioritize a single dollar out of this $26 billion budget towards roads. Now, that's cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. What we need to do is to commit ourselves to saying we're going to take a portion of all the taxes that are generated off of anything car-related, new cars, tires, brakes, service, oil, whatever it is, and we're going to prioritize those and commit those dollars to transportation needs, period.
Just to clarify, sorry to interrupt, just to clarify, you are talking about earmarking specific existing tax dollars. You are not talking about a new tax?
No, I don't want any new taxes to begin with. Now, listen, there's going to be some out there who are going to, especially the Chamber of Commerce crowd, they're going to be like, oh, my sweet goodness, how can we do anything without raising taxes? We need to raise taxes. We should all be in favor of raising taxes. I got to tell you, I'm a big full-throated supporter of Tabor. And you put that HB 1242 bill that the legislature tried to put onto the ballot this year to raise taxes, 21% sales taxes on us. That thing is going to get beaten to death at the polls, just like 103 did, just like 66 did. Those things went down 2-1 almost. This would have been the same.
That's right.
But that idea of taking this designated earmarked money, that's moving forward. In the short term, we have to take a page out of the Bill Owens book, and I think we need to take some of those gas tax dollars that we collect right now, and we're going to need to bond them. Now, I'm not a fan of bonding. I don't like the idea of debt, but when you talk about major billion-dollar projects, we're never going to save enough money to be able to spend for those as they accrue. So we need to come up with bonding to get us over that probably first $3.5 billion worth of got-to-do-it-right-now projects. And then we have these earmarked dollars to set us forward so we don't have to bond anymore. And we can continue to have a steady stream of dollars.
Let's take a call. We'll go back to the phones. And again, for those of you joining us by phone, *3 to ask a question of George Brauchier. *3 if you're joining us by phone. And also, folks, if you're listening the old-fashioned way on the radio, you can join us on our studio phones at 303-713-8255, 713-TALK if you have a question for George. Let's take a call. I believe we've got Randy in Castle Rock. Hey, Randy, you are on the show. What's your question for George Brauchier? Earth to Andy? Randy? Hello, Randy? All right, we are going to give up on Randy there, but Randy wanted to ask you specifically about fixing bridges. Any thoughts on that?
No, other than that, we have dollars right now that get designated for certain ramp projects that CDOT designates, and that includes some bridge maintenance. I mean, I think all of this stuff gets solved once we figure out how to prioritize these dollars, and that's the thing that we've been missing now over the last 10 to 12 years. The idea that we have someone under the Gold Dome saying, oh my gosh, look at how the roads have turned into these big quagmires, these big problems. We need to do something about it. Where has that leadership been over the last decade? We've had a bunch of people on that issue, on para and on others, on Fire Watch, screaming something's on fire. We need a firefighter. We need someone to put the fire out.
I'd like to ask, and in fact, I would like to have a listener ask a fairly broad question of you that I would also like to know the answer to. Let's go to Margot, a co-resident of Douglas County, along with you. Margot, what's your question for George Brauchier?
My question is, if you had a magic wand and you could wave it around and ask the legislature to put something on your desk that you would love to sign, what would that be?
My goodness, that's a good one. Boy, one quick thing that I think of that they could fix. I mean, I would love to figure out a way to get a budget onto the desk that I could sign that cuts out all the unnecessary parts of government and get us boiled down to the things that government should be doing and send the rest back to the localities. I can't tell you what that bill entails in terms of the total billions of dollars involved, but I would love to see us get back to the basics in terms of what government does. I'd like us to do a lot less, but do it a lot better. One specific bill, man, that's tough. There's so many great ideas out there that just never make it to the desk.
You are listening.
By the way, Margot
yes.
has chosen the best county in the state to live in. Boom, Douglas County.
I'm not in your county, but I am in your judicial district.
You're close.
I'm close enough. You are listening to the first in a series of gubernatorial candidate town halls brought to you by Ready Colorado, the state's leading voice for conservative education reform. You can learn more about Ready Colorado at their Facebook page, facebook.com/ReadyCOLO. I would actually like to follow up on what you just said with a question about government. Do you think you partly answered this? Tell me your thoughts about the appropriate size of state government versus what it is now. And I'd like you to focus, particularly if you could, on the number of employees in the state government. And given employee protections these days, what could you actually do if you think that the right number is smaller than the number of government employees there are now?
I suppose you could have a hiring freeze, right? And you just stop filling positions that end up getting attrited out based on retirement or terminations or whatever else takes place. That's probably the easiest way to go about it without involving yourself in a bunch of employment litigation. And my goodness, there's a ton of fellow lawyers out there who would love nothing more than to pursue that. I do think that the debate and the discussion about the size of government is one that Colorado has handled relatively well because we have Tabor. I mean, the only thing that separates us from being California, a couple states away, is the fact that we have tried to figure out a way to handcuff the legislature from willy-nilly passing increases in revenue over the top of us without our input. Now, they've figured out a way to do it, by the way. They figured out a way to do it with fees. They figured out a way to do it with enterprising certain things without rebasing the entire budget. They figured out a way to do end runs around what they call things so that they don't get under Tabor. If you talk to John Caldera, he would tell you that he thinks Tabor's eviscerated. Yeah. But I'm not convinced it's 100% gone. And I think you see that debate go on every day on the floor of the legislature. And so that appropriate size of government, that's dictated, I think, by you and I, and we continue to hold them to account for every new dollar that they want to spend, and they have to prove it to us. So when people say, are you opposed to every single new tax increase under every circumstance ever? I'd say, no, I'd have to see it under what circumstance. But you and I know that our neighbors aren't going to vote for a tax increase right now because nobody trusts the legislature to spend the money we give them already to spend it efficiently.
Well, a lot of the points you just made kind of funnel into another issue. So you talk about the size of government, you talk about fiscal responsibility, and what comes to my head is para, right? So I just looked this up. Colorado is ranked 35th out of 50 states, so towards the bottom, in terms of the unfunded liability per resident of the state due to public pensions. So do you think that para poses a threat to the financial stability of our state? And what reforms, if any, do you believe para should undergo?
Yeah, of course it poses a risk to the state, and I think people are becoming more and more aware of that every day. I think the first thing we have to do, though, is acknowledge that there are people, for right or for wrong, that are in this system that are freaked out about the idea that there are candidates running around saying, we're going to blow up para, we're going to pull the rug out from under you. There are people to whom 500,000 people that are either retirees or in this system to whom certain promises by government were made, and we need to do our best to try to honor those as much as we can. But at the same time, we have to commit ourselves to the idea that the defined benefit model is a dinosaur. It is a thing of the past, and we have to commit ourselves to figuring out a way to transition to defined contribution like the rest of the planet Earth has that has any sort of retirement. The problem is that you can't just flip a switch and do that. If we all of a sudden went from what's being contributed, and my gosh, we talk about education, these school districts, 20% of what they're paying on personnel is going to para on top of the other 8+% that the employee is paying. That's so much more than a private employer would pay. We've got to figure out a way to bridge that gap. That's the real trick. But the little things that make sense, like raising the retirement age, not for people who are 55 or 60, but my goodness, for the people who are in their 20s and 30s, absolutely. But that's just a nick, right? That just gets us over a teeny tiny bit of the hump. But each of those type things are things that we need to address and address quickly. Again, with the para problem, we've had 6.5 years of someone screaming, para's on fire, para's on fire. Where's the bucket of water? Where's the person charging in there with the hose to put this thing out? We need solutions, and we need them right now.
You are listening to the first gubernatorial candidate town hall presented by Ready Colorado, Colorado's leading voice for conservative education reform. My first guest in the series, District Attorney George Brauchier. We are going to take a short break, a 90-second break only, so you want to stick through this. Before we hit the break, let me give you our third poll question, and that is, who should have the most say in education policy? And if you're joining us by phone, okay? Hit number one on your phone if you believe state government should have the most say in education policy. Number 2, if you believe local school boards should have the most say. And number 3, if you believe parents should have the most say in education policy. Again, poll question, who should have the most say in education policy? State government hit 1, local school boards hit 2. Parents, hit 3. And if you're on the phones and want to ask a question of George, hit *3. When we come back, I will have just 1 or 2 more questions of George, and then we're going to take as many calls as we can for the time we have remaining. *3 if you're joining us by phone, 303-713-TALK if you want to join us the old-fashioned way. Stick with us. We'll be back in 90 seconds.